Okay, so let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself just, well, swimming in an ocean of information? We're constantly bombarded, aren't we? Facts, data, news, all the latest research, it just keeps coming. You accumulate so much knowledge, stacks and stacks of it, but then there's this quiet, almost persistent whisper inside you. A nagging sense that something crucial is still missing. It's that disconnect, between what you know intellectually up here and how you actually live your life day to day, how you find genuine meaning, real fulfillment. You might feel like you have all the individual pieces of the puzzle laid out, but the big picture, the one that truly makes sense of your existence, still feels elusive, hard to grasp. So today we're taking a deep dive into the profound and often misunderstood world of Continental philosophy. And our mission here isn't just to memorize names or historical dates. That's not the point. No, we're here to really unpack its core themes, its underlying philosophical currents, and the frankly monumental ideas that directly address this very human experience, this hunger for something more than just facts. This isn't merely an academic exercise, you see. It's about understanding why this particular strand of philosophy still holds immense relevance for your life. Right here, right now, amidst all that modern information overload.
Yeah, and what's truly illuminating here, what the material we're looking at really brings out, is that it frames Continental philosophy as a direct and I think quite ambitious attempt to bridge a crucial, deeply felt chasm in contemporary life. That's the gap between knowledge and wisdom. It's a distinction that's often blurred, I think, but our sources really highlight it as fundamental. It's not just about knowing facts, like, say, understanding the laws of physics or the latest economic trends, but rather about knowing how to live well. And that's a far more complex, elusive, and, well, profoundly personal pursuit. Throughout this deep dive, we'll be tracing the historical trajectory of this really rich intellectual tradition. We'll examine the fundamental questions it dares to ask, and we'll try to uncover why its insights continue to resonate so powerfully in our world today. You can probably expect to encounter some surprising facts, maybe even a few aha moments that might offer new perspectives on your own experiences. And just to be clear, our conversation will focus purely on the powerful ideas and the core philosophy embedded within our source texts. We'll be delving into their depth and their contemporary relevance, rather than getting sidetracked by, say, biographical details or extensive publication histories. This is about the thought itself, the ideas.
Absolutely. And that distinction you mentioned between knowing facts and knowing how to live well, that's where it gets really interesting when we look back at philosophy's origins, doesn't it? I mean, if we rewind to ancient Greece, the very concept of philosophy, it literally meant the love of wisdom. For towering figures like Socrates and Aristotle, wisdom wasn't some abstract concept totally divorced from reality, not at all. Instead, it was intimately, fundamentally linked to how one led a good human life. In fact, for Aristotle, a life dedicated to reflection and contemplation wasn't just part of a good life. It was, in its essence, a happy life. The two are intertwined. So philosophy in its ancient sense was an eminently practical activity, deeply interwoven with the public sphere, with the polis, the city-state. Its true purpose wasn't simply to inform citizens with a list of truths. It was to form them, to shape their character, their moral compass, their understanding of their place in the world. And this is precisely why, as our source points out, even today, if you happen to meet a philosopher at a party, your instinct might still be to lean in and ask, maybe with a hopeful glint in your eye, so what is the meaning of life then? That natural, almost timeless assumption, it turns out, is fully justified by philosophy's ancient and enduring ideal of wisdom. It really speaks to a deep human need that hasn't just disappeared.
Right. Building on that, if we connect this to the broader historical picture, we witness a stark, really pivotal shift that began to unfold around the 17th century. Philosophy's focus, which had for centuries embraced this holistic pursuit of wisdom, dramatically narrowed. It shifted. It became overwhelmingly concerned with knowledge, or scientia, particularly in the mold of the emerging modern natural sciences. With its rigorous methods of empirical proof, its emphasis on verifiable claims, and its incredible predictive power, modern science rapidly took center stage in defining how things are the way they are. That became the dominant model, and this transformed philosophy's role from being a guide for living into something quite different. It largely morphed into epistemology, the theory of knowledge dedicating itself to understanding the nature, origin, and limits of knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? John Locke famously articulated this new role, describing philosophy as an underlaboral to science, whose task was basically to clear away some of the rubbish that lies in the way to knowledge.
Just tidying up, basically.
Exactly. In this new scientific paradigm, philosophers, perhaps somewhat ironically, became, as the source puts it, janitors in the Crystal Palace of the Sciences, meticulously tidying up conceptual issues so that the grand enterprise of science could proceed unimpeded. Yet, despite the undeniable wonders and transformative power of science, just consider how technology has reshaped our lives. From medicine to communication, it's incredible. Despite all that, the fundamental question of wisdom still nags at us, as our source poignantly puts it. It persists, like an appendix we believe we no longer needed. An irritation, a kind of vestigial organ of meaning that, despite all our scientific advancements, still demands attention. This persistent, unfulfilled longing for wisdom is absolutely crucial for understanding the enduring appeal and the central mission of Continental philosophy.
Yeah, and this brings us right to what our sources compellingly call the felt gap, this profound, almost paradoxical experience of modernity. Far from closing the chasm between knowledge and wisdom, the rise of the scientific conception of the world, our technological prowess, the sheer volume of information available, it actually seems to make us feel this gap more acutely. The text makes a powerful, almost unsettling observation here. In scientifically and technologically highly developed societies, this gap doesn't just widen, it kind of expands into an abyss. Think about our current world. We have more material abundance, more access to information, more control over our environment than any generation before us, arguably. Basic needs are largely met for many. And earthly blessings, from rapid travel to instant global communication, they just abound. Yet, despite this unprecedented comfort and capability, humanity still manages to concoct new miseries, neuroses, and pathologies. It's strange, isn't it? We face an existential question that seems to echo in countless hearts. I seem to have everything I need and want, but what is the point in my life? It's a chilling paradox. Having everything might just leave us feeling, well, nothing, an emptiness. And this dilemma, this gaping void of meaning, often drives people to desperate attempts to fill it, whether it's a return to traditional religious frameworks or the 57 varieties of esotericism we see flourishing today, from intricate astrological charts to the comforting weight of crystals or even the latest self-help gurus. These pursuits, while understandable in their motivation, can unfortunately sometimes devolve into what our source terms obscurantism. And this is a key concept we'll need to explore further because it represents one pole of a really critical dilemma.
Precisely. The sources present this as a profound, almost unavoidable dilemma that Continental philosophy grapples with directly. On one side, we have what is termed scientism. The philosophical cost of scientific truth, if you take it to its extreme, seems to be scientism, which, in its most reductive form, the source warns, turns us into beasts.
What does that mean exactly, beasts?
Well, it implies that if all valid knowledge must conform to the scientific method, then anything beyond empirical, verifiable facts, things like ethics, aesthetics, existential meaning, it's either dismissed as purely subjective preference or it gets reduced to mere neurological processes or biological drives. It sort of strips away our unique human experience or capacity for judgment, choice, meaning-making, leaving us with a purely mechanistic view of ourselves, a kind of biological machine. Yet on the other side, the understandable rejection of this narrow scientism, this urge for a new humanization of the cosmos, risks falling into obscurantism, potentially turning us into lunatics, as the source rather dramatically puts it.
Lunatics, okay.
Obscurantism here means the deliberate obfuscation of knowledge, or the active resistance to clear understanding. It often replaces empirical explanations with vague, mystical, or uncritical assertions, prioritizing maybe comfort or a sense of deeper meaning over reasoned inquiry. Neither of these extremes, right, the dehumanizing force of scientism or the irrational embrace of obscurantism, neither is attractive or conducive to a truly well-lived, meaningful life. So this then raises an important question. If we're sort of stuck between these two pitfalls, how can we navigate this complex terrain? And much of Continental philosophy's enduring appeal and its profound relevance lies precisely in its attempt to unify or at least move closer together questions of knowledge and wisdom, of philosophical truth and existential meaning. It seeks a path that acknowledges the power of reason and empirical inquiry while simultaneously validating and exploring the deeper, often unsettling questions of human existence.
Can you give some examples of thinkers who try to do that?
Absolutely. Think of the rich tapestry of thinkers who have grappled with this. Consider Hegel's intricate exploration of the life and death struggle for recognition. He argues that self-consciousness emerges through conflict and interaction, inherently linking our understanding of self to our social world and our quest for meaning within it. or Nietzsche's radical pronouncements on the death of God and his call for a revaluation of values, not as an abandonment of meaning, mind you, but as an urgent demand for humanity to create new meaning and new forms of wisdom in a world that's lost its transcendent anchors. You have Marx's incisive analysis of alienation, where human labor and creativity become estranged from the individual under capitalism, and his powerful call for emancipation that's directly concerned with reclaiming a holistic, meaningful existence beyond just economic determinism. Freud's revelations about the unconscious repression, about the hidden forces that shape our conscious lives, unveil a deep, often uncomfortable truth about human agency and self-knowledge, moving beyond purely rational explanations of behavior. Then there's Heidegger's profound inquiries into anxiety, angst, and authentic existence, challenging us to confront our own finitude and mortality, compelling us to find meaning in our being in the world rather than through abstract knowledge. Sartre's wrestling with bad faith and radical freedom places the immense burden of meaning-making squarely on the individual, forcing us to ask how we live authentically in a world without predetermined values. Camus's confrontation with the absurdity of existence, the inherent lack of ultimate meaning, paradoxically calls for a defiant embrace of life itself. And Levinas's emphasis on our infinite ethical responsibilities to others places human connection and intersubjectivity at the very core of meaning and moral wisdom. This tradition, as our source highlights, feels closer to the grain and detail of human existence. It really delves into the drama of human hopes, fears, and the myriad woes and weals our flesh is prone to, refusing to simply reduce them to scientific data points.
That's a powerful overview of the stakes and, the incredibly diverse responses within this tradition. Now, to truly understand how this rich and multifaceted tradition developed, we really need to trace its historical lineage, don't we? And that journey inevitably brings us to Immanuel Kant. He's often described as the final great fenter common to both Continental and Analytic traditions, and who announces the parting of their ways. It's like a grand philosophical crossroads. The paths of subsequent thought diverge dramatically based on how his work was interpreted and which aspects were prioritized. We can, broadly speaking, approach Kant in a couple of different ways. One well-trodden path involves focusing heavily on his first critique, the critique of pure reason. His monumental work is largely epistemological, concerned with the fundamental question of how we know what we know. Kant famously sought to ground empirical knowledge against the radical skepticism of David Hume through what he called his Copernican turn. He proposed that objects of experience conform to our innate concepts and categories of understanding, rather than our minds just passively receiving data from objects. This reading of Kant tends to emphasize his profound contributions to the theory of knowledge, the philosophy of science, and the limits of human cognition. It's very much focused on the knowledge side of things.
Exactly. But the other path, the one that Continental philosophy largely followed ever since, leads through Kant's third critique, the critique of the power of judgment. This work, sometimes less emphasized but no less significant, attempts to build a crucial bridge between two seemingly disparate realms Kant had established. Understanding, which gives us knowledge of the natural world governed by causality, and reason, which governs our ethical life and freedom. He sought to do this through the faculty of judgment, particularly aesthetic judgment, our experience of beauty, and teleological judgment, our understanding of purpose in nature. For the post-Kantian thinkers, the ambition of this third critique became the burning philosophical issue. Could the deep dualisms Kant had seemingly left us with pure theoretical reason versus practical moral reason, the mechanical laws of nature versus human freedom, objective knowledge versus subjective value, could they truly be unified into a coherent, meaningful whole?
So it was about trying to put the pieces back together.
Precisely. And this internal tension within reason itself became a significant problem. The German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, with its rallying cry of "Dare to know," proclaimed the sovereignty of reason, the powerful idea that reason possesses the capacity and authority to critically examine all our beliefs, traditions, and institutions. But, and this raises an important question, if reason can criticize everything, mustn't it also turn its critical gaze upon itself? This leads to the urgent need for a meta-critique of critique, a term brilliantly coined by Kant's early and influential critic, Johann Georg Hamann. Hamann argued that Kant's philosophy ultimately broke down into a series of vicious dualisms, these artificial separations like form-content or nature-freedom, and that Kant's practical reason, which was supposed to ground morality, was left as an empty formalism. Beautiful in its abstract universalism, perhaps, but lacking in concrete human particularity. Strikingly, Hamann even foreshadowed the 20th century linguistic turn by asserting that Thought depends on language, emphasizing that our conceptual frameworks are inherently embedded in and shaped by the specific languages we use, languages which are themselves a complex mixture of both reason and lived experience. This radical self-criticism of reason, this turning of reason upon itself, raised a terrifying fear among these thinkers, that it would inevitably end in nihilism, leading to a profound doubt about the existence of everything. That fear, the text states, was the sum and substance of the crisis of the Aufklärung. The very tool meant to enlighten threatened to dissolve all meaning. It was a genuine crisis.
Wow. Yeah, that fear of reason dissolving into nihilism truly set the intellectual stage for an intense period. Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, a central and provocative figure in the late 18th century pantheism and atheism conflicts, starkly articulated this predicament. Jacobi argued that rationalism, if you followed it consistently and rigorously to its ultimate conclusions, would inevitably lead to atheism. He presented what he saw as a dramatic and inescapable choice for humanity: either embrace this unsettling rational atheism, which denies any transcendent foundation for morality or meaning, or make an irrational leap of faith, a conscious, non-rational commitment to belief, kind of echoing Pascal's famous wager. This profound conflict, as our source notes, set one of the defining issues of the whole Continental tradition, the problem of the authority of reason. It's almost as if what we now term the postmodern predicament, the crisis of meaning and foundational values, truly began way back then in the late 18th century. This tension then escalated into the infamous atheist conflict of 1798, a scandal that led to the dismissal of the prominent philosopher Fichte from the University of Jena. Jacobi accused Fichtean idealism, with its emphasis on the absolute ego as the ground of all reality, of precisely this nihilism. He argued that by reducing everything to the activity of the ego, Fichte's system left no knowledge of objects or subjects in themselves, dissolving the external world and even other individuals into mere projections of the self, a kind of radical subjectivism. Jacobi dramatically protested, conveying the existential horror of this reduction. If the highest upon which I can reflect is my empty and pure, naked and mere ego, then rationality is for me a curse. I deplore my existence. Pretty strong words.
Very strong.
His conclusion was an intense, almost theological warning. God is and is outside of me, or I am God. There is no third. He implied that by denying a transcendent God, humanity risks elevating itself into the position of God, embarking on what he called a Promethean temptation, a dangerous ambition, where we attempt to create meaning and reality from nothing, much like Frankenstein bringing his creation to life without truly understanding the consequences.
That's a powerful image, isn't it?
Humanity attempting to fill the void of meaning by becoming its own sole creator.
Absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here is how these intense criticisms and the perceived failures of Kant's system directly informed and shaped the trajectory of subsequent post-Kantian philosophy. Salomon Maimon, another of Kant's sharpest and most insightful critics, keenly observed that Kant's dualisms, such as the fundamental separation between understanding and sensibility, were so profound, so deeply entrenched, that they actually prevented the necessary interaction between these faculties. This, Maimon argued, ultimately invalidated the very transcendental deduction that Kant aimed to achieve, the process by which Kant sought to demonstrate the necessary role of our innate mental structures in shaping our experience. For Maimon, this amounted to a performative self-contradiction at the very heart of Kant's system. The method contradicted its own premises.
So the system couldn't hold itself up.
That was the critique. So the urgent and defining task for post-Kantian philosophy became clear. To overcome these pernicious dualisms, the disjunctions between mind and world, freedom and nature, knowledge and value, by discovering and articulating a higher unifying principle. This profound quest for unity in a fragmented world is what truly defines the problematic of continental philosophy. It lays the groundwork for its distinctive approach to understanding human existence and the nature of reality. And we see diverse and incredibly influential responses to this challenge from the next generation of thinkers. Fichte, grappling with Jacobi's critique, found this unifying principle in the subject's radical activity and moral freedom, positing the ego not as isolated, but as an active, world-creating force. Schelling, in contrast, saw it in the dynamic notions of force or life, viewing nature itself as a living, evolving organism. Hegel, perhaps the most ambitious, located unity in the unfolding of spirit, a grand historical process of consciousness realizing itself and reconciling contradictions through dialectic. Schopenhauer, taking a darker turn, found this ultimate reality in the blind, irrational will. Nietzsche, in his own radical revaluation, identified it with the will to power, a fundamental drive that underpins all life and value. Marx shifted the focus to praxis. human transformative activity in the world, particularly in the realm of economic and social production. Freud uncovered it in the complex, often contradictory forces of the unconscious, and Heidegger, returning to the most fundamental question, sought it in the elusive concept of being itself and our particular way of existing as descent. Each of these foundational thinkers, in their own unique way, sought to bridge the profound gaps Kant had revealed, thereby establishing the profound, often existential concerns that continue to characterize the Continental tradition. How to live a coherent, meaningful life in a world that often feels fractured.
That's a powerful point about the problematic set by these post-Kantian thinkers, this enduring quest for a unifying principle. But let's take a step back for a moment and clarify something that's often a source of confusion. Okay, let's unpack this term continental philosophy itself, because it's truly, as the source says, a contested concept. It's not a neatly defined school of thought, is it? But rather a highly eclectic and disparate series of intellectual currents that Europe itself wouldn't necessarily recognize as a unified whole. In many ways, the term is an invention or a projection of the Anglo-American Academy, a convenient but often misleading label used to categorize something that might not exist as a coherent entity on the continent itself.
Right, it's a label applied from the outside, in a way.
Exactly. Bernard Williams, a philosopher who kind of straddled both traditions, famously noted the confusion. He said the distinction often conflates geographical terms, Anglo-American versus continental Europe, with methodological ones, analytic versus phenomenological or hermeneutic. He quipped that it's as if one were to classify cars into front-wheel drive and Japanese, a humorous but pointed way of highlighting the category error. And this imprecise labeling has led to some really ingrained and often unhelpful stereotypes, hasn't it? Analytic philosophy is frequently lauded for precision, conceptual clarity, systematic rigor, often with an underlying implication that these are virtues lacking elsewhere. Meanwhile, continental philosophy is often dismissed, sometimes with disdain, as speculative metaphysics or cultural hermeneutics or wool-gathering in bathos. Just fuzzy thinking.
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
Consider the famous anecdote where Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a leading French phenomenologist, approached the British analytic philosopher Gilbert Ryle, asking, "Is not our program the same?" Ryle's dismissive, almost cutting retort, "J'espère que non," I hope not, perfectly captures the perceived gulf and mutual suspicion between these two philosophical cultures. It's a vivid illustration of how deep these divides could run.
Indeed, that Ryle Merleau-Ponty anecdote highlights a genuine chasm. If we connect this to the bigger picture, our sources argue that the term continental philosophy is problematic not just for its geographical ambiguity, but because it functions on two different levels simultaneously. It's both a professional self-description, a way philosophy departments have organized themselves, particularly since the 1970s, establishing distinct curricula and academic identities, and it speaks to an ancient cultural meaning. The former, unfortunately, overlays and often obscures the latter, leading to contested and corrosive disputes that can hinder genuine philosophical engagement. A powerful, almost comical example of this profound misunderstanding is the reported discussion between the British logical positivist A.J. Ayer and the French surrealist Georges Bataille. They apparently debated whether the sun existed before human beings.
Seriously, that was the debate.
Apparently so. Ayer, operating from a strictly scientific and empirical viewpoint, naturally asserted, yes, of course it did. Bataille, coming from a phenomenological and more radically subjective perspective, argued that the question itself was meaningless without a human subject to perceive and conceptualize the sun. He wasn't denying the physical star, but the meaning of its existence for us. Bataille famously concluded from this exchange that there was a sort of abyss between French and English philosophers, a fundamental difference in their very approach to reality and meaning. However, our sources delve deeper, suggesting this isn't just an external division between nations, but an internal cultural split. John Stuart Mill's insightful essays on Jeremy Bentham and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, written well before these two cultures formally split, reveal this. Mill saw a fundamental division within Englishness itself. Bentham represented the utilitarian, empiricist tradition focused on truth, knowledge, and practical results, while Coleridge embodied the romantic, spiritual tradition concerned with meaning, wisdom, and the inner life. Mill described this intellectual schism as rootedly sectarian, akin to profound religious intolerance, demonstrating that this divide has deep historical and cultural roots, not just academic ones.
Mill's profound insight that human beings are concerned by questions of both knowledge and wisdom. They require both spectacles to look through and eyes to see with. That really brings this point home, doesn't it? It reminds us that we need both empirical tools to understand the world out there and an inner lens to make sense of our experience in here. This leads us directly to C.P. Snow's famous 1959 Reed lecture, where he diagnosed the two cultures. Snow observed a profound loss of a common culture in modern society, where highly educated individuals, particularly scientists on one side and literary intellectuals on the other, could no longer genuinely communicate or understand each other on their major intellectual concerns. He described this as leading to something like hostility, a lack of empathy, and a deepening of misunderstanding between two vital intellectual spheres. So, what does this all mean for us, for you listening today? This isn't just a fascinating historical anecdote or some obscure academic squabble from decades past. It describes a fundamental tension that is still deeply present in our culture, affecting how we approach everything from scientific advancement and technological innovation to grappling with social problems and personal existential questions. Our source powerfully suggests that the truth is the whole, meaning we shouldn't feel forced to take sides in this supposed culture war. But rather, we should strive to understand and, ideally, integrate both perspectives, recognizing that both scientific knowledge and humanistic wisdom are essential for a complete understanding of ourselves and our world.
Right. And Richard Rorty, a pragmatist philosopher, once made a rather provocative observation about the actual practices within philosophy. He suggested that analytic philosophy tends to deal with problems, abstract, often formal issues like the nature of truth or reference, while continental philosophy, by contrast, seems to deal more with proper names. Focusing intensely on the text and ideas of specific historical figures, often resulting in titles like The Concept of Truth in Husserl and Heidegger instead of just The Concept of Truth.
So more about the history of ideas.
Well, while this might sound to some critics like mere commentary rather than original thought, it actually highlights a distinct and deeply rich practice of philosophy inherent in the Continental tradition. What's truly fascinating here is that Continental philosophy, far from being just commentary, emphasizes the essentially historical nature of philosophy as a practice and the essentially historical nature of the philosopher. This concept, which they term historicity, is incredibly important for understanding their approach. It's not just that philosophy has a history, but that it is historical to its core. Our thinking is always situated. And this historicity implies two critical things. First, the radical finitude of the human subject.
Meaning we're limited.
Exactly. It means there's no objective, godlike, eternal vantage point from which to grasp universal, timeless truths. Our perspective is always limited, shaped by our specific time, language, culture, personal experiences. We are always in history, not outside it looking down. Second, it implies the thoroughly contingent or created character of human experience. This challenges the notion that our world, our values, our ways of being are simply given or naturally ordained. Instead, they are all too human, meaning they are constructed, built, and continually remade by us through our actions, our traditions, our collective history. This isn't just an academic point. It fundamentally shifts the understanding of wisdom from a timeless discovery to a continuous, historically embedded creation and reevaluation. We make meaning. We don't just find it fully formed.
That insight, that human experience is all too human and fundamentally contingent, that has truly profound consequences, doesn't it? It leads directly to what our source calls the demand that things be otherwise. If our world, our social structures, our understanding of what is normal are human creations, then they can be recreated in different, perhaps better ways. This is the radical, emancipatory spirit that underpins much of Continental thought. Think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's powerful and enduring rallying cry from the 18th century. Man was born free, but is everywhere in chains. This encapsulates the core idea that our current state of affairs isn't natural or inevitable, but rather a product of human institutions and historical developments that can be challenged and transformed. From this perspective, critique and emancipation aren't separate endeavors. They are, as our source says, two ends of the same piece of string. You can't really have one without the other.
Critique enables change.
Right. The active critique of exposing the contingent and constructed nature of our world is itself the first step towards imagining and enacting emancipation, towards liberation. Our source highlights a truly remarkable and incredibly naive, maybe yet radiant fragment from 1796, often attributed to the young Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin. It's called the oldest system program of German idealism. This text, written by these brilliant young minds, calls for a radical reconciliation of the dualisms of critical system, those fractures between theoretical knowledge and practical life that Kant had identified, and proposes achieving this unification through art, envisioning the philosopher becoming like the poet.
Through art. Interesting.
Yeah, the core ideas of this ambitious program are fascinating. It envisions a mythology of reason, not a return to irrational myths, but a new symbolic language capable of embodying abstract philosophical ideas, making reason concrete, sensuous, and deeply felt by the people, leading to a profound eternal unity. This mythology, they believed, would be inherently critical and emancipatory, ultimately aiming for nothing less than the destruction of the state, which they saw as treating individuals like mere cogs in a machine, and the establishment of a new organization of society based on freedom and equality. It's a breathtaking vision, culminating in the bold assertion that truth and goodness are brothers only in beauty. This speaks to a holistic approach where aesthetic experience, intellectual understanding, and ethical living are fundamentally intertwined in the pursuit of a truly liberated human existence.
This commitment to a transformative philosophy raises an important question, though. How does this appeal to tradition, which we said is so central to Continental thought, actually relate to this radical vision of change? It sounds almost contradictory. But the sources make it clear that the appeal to tradition in Continental thought is in no way traditional in a conservative sense. It's not about passively accepting the past or reverting to older forms. Rather, it's a critical confrontation with the history of philosophy. Consider Heidegger's powerful concept of destruction, which isn't about destruction in a negative sense, but a destructuring or dismantling of the history of Western metaphysics. His aim was to uncover forgotten positive tendencies and work against baleful prejudices that accumulated over centuries, obscuring the original question of being. Similarly, Edmund Husserl, the founder of Phenomenology, spoke of the reactivation of a sedimented tradition. For instance, in his analysis of the origin of geometry, he showed how seemingly abstract mathematical concepts arise from concrete, lived experiences and practices in the life world are everyday reality. He reminds us that even highly scientific attitudes emerge from this more fundamental, pre-theoretical layer of human existence. For much of the Continental tradition, then, philosophy's purpose is not merely to solve problems, but fundamentally the production of crisis.
The production of crisis. That sounds disruptive.
It is. It serves as a critique of existing praxis because it is felt to be unjust, unfree, or untrue. It's a call to arms, a philosophical awakening aspiring towards individual or collective emancipation. The real crisis, as the source eloquently puts it, is not crisis itself, but the absence of crisis, a state of thoughtless amnesia where we live unreflectively, like happy cattle, oblivious to the deeper forces shaping our lives and the potential for a more authentic existence. This critical practice, therefore, follows a dynamic model, critique leading to praxis-informed action, and ultimately aiming towards emancipation.
That concept of philosophy as the production of crisis is really potent. Yeah, it suggests that comfort and complacency are actually dangerous in a way. But let's return to the lingering problem Kant left us with, which truly highlights the chasm between knowledge and wisdom. Kant, as we discussed, leaves us with this profound dilemma. How can our freedom, rooted in the moral law, actually take effect in a natural world governed purely by mechanical causality? We're left feeling amphibious, as the source says, both free and yet alienated, our moral freedom reduced to an abstraction, in a universe that appears to operate like a giant mechanistic clockwork. This sense of being fundamentally split within ourselves, between our capacity for moral agency and the deterministic forces of nature, sets the stage for one of philosophy's most challenging diagnoses. And here's where it gets really interesting with Friedrich Nietzsche. Profoundly influential for countless 20th century Continental thinkers, Nietzsche diagnoses nihilism not just as a casual pessimism, but as a collapse of moral certainty in the world that critically coincides with the recognition of this very human freedom. It's the realization that if we are truly free, then the old external sources of moral authority have crumbled, leaving us adrift, without a map.
The ground falls away.
Exactly. And he drew significant inspiration from the Russian context of nihilism, which had a more obviously sociopolitical dimension. Think of characters like Dazarov in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, or the revolutionary fervor in Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done. This Russian strain of nihilism was characterized by a skeptical, anti-aesthetic, utilitarian worldview that often contrasted sharply with the romanticism of the era, Bazarov's famous declaration in Fathers and Sons captures this radical spirit perfectly. Everything, we repudiate everything. It's an intellectual rejection of all existing values and institutions.
Right. And what's truly fascinating here is Nietzsche's audacious and original conception of nihilism, which goes far beyond mere skepticism or political rejection. For him, the core idea is that the highest values devalue themselves. It's not just that we choose to reject them, but that their intrinsic development, their own internal logic, leads to their own collapse. As he famously declared, the aim is lacking, why finds no answer. There's no ultimate justification left. This is captured in his epoch-making proclamation, God is dead, which he attributes not to a single event or external proof, but to us, humanity, and our internal intellectual and moral development. We did it to ourselves, in a way. Nihilism, for Nietzsche, is this profound breakdown of meaning, where transcendent values like those traditionally provided by religion or universal morality become null and void. They lose their power. He argues that the Christian moral interpretation of the world, driven by a powerful will to truthfulness, paradoxically turns against itself. In its relentless search for ultimate truth, it ultimately discovers that its true world, the eternal, unchanging realm posited as superior to our transient world of becoming, is in fact merely a fable, a human construction.
So the pursuit of truth undermines the very truth it sought.
Exactly. This self-overcoming of morality leads to a central antagonism, a profound crisis of belief. We are not to esteem what we know, meaning we can no longer truly value the scientific, empirical understanding of a meaningless universe. And we are not allowed to esteem the lies we should like to tell ourselves, meaning we cannot simply invent comforting fictions to replace lost truths without being dishonest to ourselves. We can no longer believe in a transcendent truth, yet we find it impossible to endure this world of becoming, this fleeting, chaotic existence, without some form of meaning. That's the crux of his challenge. It's a real bind.
Yeah, that inherent contradiction, the inability to believe in old truths, yet struggling to live without them. That naturally leads to various forms of nascent nihilism that Nietzsche observed in his time, and that we can still see echoes of today, can't we? First, there's passive nihilism. He likened it to Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimism, or a kind of European Buddhism. This is the attitude of resigned acceptance, affirming the void rather than fighting it. It's the person who shrugs and says, if there's no inherent meaning, if everything is ultimately meaningless, well, I might as well just cultivate my inner peace and take up yoga, a kind of detached, quiet surrender to the meaninglessness, a profound weariness.
The giving up, almost.
Kind of. Second, we have active nihilism, which Nietzsche exemplified through the radicalism of Russian anarchism. He saw this as a wildly creative, even violent form of terrorism, where the response to a void of meaning is to actively destroy everything around me. It's the desire to tear down all existing structures, all false idols, to clear the slate entirely. Think of the Situationists' famous May '68 slogan, "Under the paving stones, it's a beach," a call to uncover a more authentic reality through radical, even destructive acts.
A much more energetic response.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And finally, there's a more widespread cultural mood of apathy or weariness, what we might call armchair nihilism, the, oh, well, I guess that's just the way it is, attitude. A kind of resigned indifference to the ultimate meaninglessness of things, perhaps personified by, I don't know, Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh.
Chuckles, possibly.
However, it's crucial to remember that for Nietzsche himself, his entire body of work is defined by its resistance to nihilism. He didn't advocate for nihilism. He diagnosed it. He diagnosed it only to demand a radical revaluation of values, an active creative effort to forge new meanings, new purposes, new forms of wisdom in a world that has outgrown its old ones. He saw it as a challenge to overcome.
Precisely. And this profound diagnosis then raises an important question. If the old values have devalued themselves and we're left in this state of nihilism, how does one truly overcome it, rather than just succumb to one of its forms? Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return of the same offers a radical and deeply challenging answer. It's a hyper-Kantian thought experiment, a thought that's meant to test the very limits of our will to affirm life. Imagine, he posits, existence without meaning or aim, yet recurring inevitably without any finale of nothingness. Everything happens again, exactly the same, forever. This isn't presented as a cosmological theory, but an ethical imperative. Could you, in this very moment, affirm this thought? Could you embrace your life, every joy and every sorrow, knowing it will repeat eternally? If you can say yes to life in its entirety without needing external justification, then you overcome nihilism. It's an attempt to think the universe consistently without God and to find meaning not in transcendence, but in an absolute affirmation of immanence of this life right now.
That's a heavy thought experiment.
It is, and this struggle with nihilism then ties into a broader theme that has profoundly shaped continental thought, what we call the dialectic of enlightenment. This concept refers to the paradox that the very tools and values of the Enlightenment reason, progress, scientific mastery have, over time, not only failed to get a grip on everyday life, but lead instead to its progressive dissolution. We see this in the relentless processes of rationalization, the pervasive capitalization of all aspects of life, the dominance of instrumental rationality that prioritizes efficiency over meaning, and the pervasive forgetfulness of being, a state where we become so engrossed in managing beings, things, objects, data, that we forget to ask the fundamental question of what it means to be. This predicament, where philosophy itself seems to have lost its way, or even, as the source suggests, conspired with the very forces that produce nihilism, leads continental philosophy to seek answers in non-philosophical discourses and practices. It turns to art, poetry, psychoanalysis, politics, economics, recognizing that these fields might offer pathways to meaning and critique that traditional philosophy, in its narrow academic form, has overlooked. We then see responses to this crisis bifurcate into two broad streams of modernism. There's progressive modernism, exemplified by thinkers like Marx, the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, and Jürgen Habermas. They generally advocate for a reciprocal relationship between philosophy and sociology, often aligning with leftist political thought, aiming for social emancipation and human liberation. And then there's reactionary modernism, seen in figures like Oswald Spengler, Carl Schmitt, and Martin Heidegger. They offer a more pessimistic cultural critique, with philosophy directly informing social analysis, sometimes with deeply conservative or even, in some cases, national socialist tendencies. Both of these streams, despite their vast ideological differences, engage in what I have called the production of crisis, a relentless, critical questioning of the present state of affairs.
That's a truly fascinating point about the production of crisis and how philosophy has wrestled with the unintended consequences of the Enlightenment. To bring this divide into sharper focus, let's delve into a specific, almost iconic example of this two cultures clash. The rather curious standoff between Martin Heidegger and Rudolf Carnap in the 1930s. This intellectual confrontation beautifully epitomizes the profound differences between the scientific conception of the world, championed by Carnap, and what our source calls the existential or hermeneutic experience that Heidegger was exploring. Carnap's views, as we know, became foundational for logical positivism, heavily influencing figures like A.J. Ayer and shaping the trajectory of analytic philosophy in the U.S. through later thinkers like W.V.O. Quine. Carnap notoriously viewed much of traditional metaphysics as, to put it mildly, charlatanism, arguing it lacked cognate meaning, basically nonsense.
Pretty much, yeah.
Inversely, Heidegger became a towering, complex inspiration for subsequent German thinkers, including Hans-Georg Gadamer and Hannah Arendt, and a whole host of French luminaries, from Jean-Paul Sartre and Michel Foucault to Jacques Derrida. Understanding this particular intense misunderstanding between Heidegger and Carnap is absolutely crucial to grasping the deeper philosophical, methodological, and ultimately cultural schism that continues to resonate today.
Indeed, that specific encounter between Heidegger and Carnap serves as a perfect lens through which to view these diverging philosophical paths. Central to this case study is Heidegger's 1929 inaugural lecture, famously titled, "What is Metaphysics?" In this lecture, Heidegger profoundly re-engages with the Aristotelian notion of philosophia praecourt first philosophy, which traditionally deals with being as such prior to the study of specific beings, like a tree, a chair, or a human. This fundamental distinction between being as such, what it means to be, and particular beings, the things that are, is what Heidegger calls the ontological difference. It's a core concept for him. In one crucial sense, Heidegger positions himself as a metaphysician because he fiercely asserts that fundamental philosophical questions, particularly the question of being, cannot be reduced to scientific inquiry. He argues that science, by its very nature, focuses on specific beings within the world, but it doesn't, and indeed cannot, ask about the being of those beings. Science asks what and how, not the fundamental why of existence itself. He is, therefore, retrieving this ancient, fundamental question that he believes Western philosophy has largely forgotten. Yet, paradoxically, he is also an anti-metaphysician in another sense, because he believes that traditional metaphysics in its long history has passed over the radicality of the question of being, and crucially, its intrinsic link to time, as explored in Being and Time. For Heidegger, questioning is the piety of thinking, implying a profound reverence for the act of inquiry itself. His ultimate goal is an overcoming of metaphysics, not by dismissing it, but by rethinking its deepest questions from a new, more fundamental perspective, one rooted in human existence, in Dasein.
Okay, so Heidegger's digging deep into being. In stark contrast, you have Rudolf Carnap in the Vienna Circle championing a very different motto: science free from metaphysics. For them, philosophy's sole legitimate role was logical clarification of empirical science. That was it. They didn't see themselves as practicing philosophy in the traditional speculative sense, but rather as engaging in a rigorous logical analysis to clear the conceptual path for scientific progress, sort of like philosophical hygiene.
Chuckles. That's one way to put it.
This meant a radical redefinition of what counted as meaningful inquiry. For Carnap, metaphysical propositions weren't simply false. They were much more dramatically meaningless. They lacked any cognitive content. Why? Because they were neither logically verifiable, like tautology's all bachelors are unmarried, which are true by definition, nor empirically verifiable, like statements about the physical world that can be tested through observation, water boils at 100 C. Famously, and with a touch of biting humor, Carnap quipped that metaphysicians are musicians without musical ability. Yeah. He believed that metaphysics might express legitimate feelings or a general attitude towards life, but it did so poorly, clumsily, and nonsensically, unlike true art or poetry. He actually cited Nietzsche's Zarathustra as an example of art expressing attitude well, which could genuinely convey such attitudes effectively. So for Carnap, Heidegger's profound questions about being were not profound at all, but simply confused grammar, category mistakes, lacking any discernible meaning, just noise.
Exactly. And it was precisely this point, this idea that metaphysics is meaningless, that Heidegger directly confronted in his lecture. He started by acknowledging the scientific stance. Science deals with things, with particular beings, and besides that, nothing. Okay. But he then provocatively asks, what about this nothing, the nothing that science excludes? For Heidegger, the nothing is more originary than the not and negation. It's not just the absence of something. It's a more fundamental, active force or presence that underlies all existence and all meaning. He argues for an effective disclosure of the world where moods, and particularly angst, anxiety, as distinct from specific fear, are not mere subjective feelings. Instead, they are fundamental ways in which our existence, our Dasein, is disclosed to us. They reveal the world in a certain way.
So anxiety is just feeling bad.
Not just that. Angst, unlike fear of a specific object, is about the whole of one's being, revealing the unsettling nothingness of all things that surround us and within us, the groundlessness of existence. It's in this profound experience of anxiety that the ultimate metaphysical question arises. Why are there beings at all, and why not rather nothing? This question for Heidegger isn't a scientific one that can be answered with data, but a deeply existential one that reveals the contingency, the utter groundlessness of all existence. His conclusion is uncompromising, directly challenging the scientific view. Philosophy is essentially metaphysics, and human Dasein, existence, can comport itself toward beings only if it holds itself out into the nothing. This going beyond is metaphysics itself. For Heidegger, science itself and its relentless pursuit of knowledge about beings rests upon this more fundamental existential encounter with nothingness, even if it doesn't acknowledge it.
Wow. Okay, that's a truly powerful articulation of the divide. On one side, Carnap's quest for logical clarity and verifiable meaning. On the other, Heidegger's profound exploration of anxiety, nothingness, and being. But Carnap's position, while immensely influential, wasn't without its own significant critiques, even from within the analytic tradition, right?
Absolutely not. It came under heavy fire.
First, Karl Popper, another prominent philosopher of science, argued Carnap's verification principle. The idea that a statement is meaningful only if it can be empirically verified was simply too narrow for actual scientific practice. Popper proposed that scientific theories are often speculative and are judged not just by verification, but more critically by their refutability, by whether they can be disproven. Falsification, not verification. Think of Einstein's theory of relativity. It's meaningful not because it was fully verified at its inception, but because it made predictions that could be proven wrong. Second, the verification principle itself faced a glaring logical flaw, a kind of performative self-contradiction. How is the principle of verification itself verified?
Yeah, that's the classic critique.
It's neither a tautology, true by definition, nor an empirical statement, testable by experience. So, as our source colorfully puts it, how can this razor shave itself? If it can't, then the very foundation of Carnap's system seems undermined. Third, and perhaps most famously, Carnap's own student, W.V.O. Quine, delivered a devastating blow with his essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Quine attacked both the cherished analytic synthetic distinction, the idea that statements are either true by definition or true by empirical observation, and what he called radical reductionism, the idea that every meaningful statement can be reduced to simple sensory data. Quine argued instead that our knowledge is a holistic man-made fabric, a vast web of interconnected beliefs that impinges on experience only along the edges, implying a thoroughgoing pragmatism where no statement is immune to revision. The whole system faces experience together.
It was a major shift in analytic philosophy.
Absolutely. So the ground beneath Carnap's logical positivism began to shift significantly. But then there's the fascinating and often misunderstood mediation of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay, let's unpack this. Despite inspiring logical positivism with his early work, the Tractatus, Wittgenstein later distanced himself significantly, particularly in the late 1920s and beyond, evolving his thought in radical ways. In 1929, explicitly responding to Heidegger's lecture on metaphysics, Wittgenstein remarked, "To be sure, I can readily think what Heidegger means by being and anxiety. Nevertheless, we do run up against the limits of language."
So he saw something there, but
Exactly. For Wittgenstein, Heidegger's attempt to say the unsayable, to articulate the profound experience of nothingness and being, ultimately resulted in nonsense, not because it lacked an underlying feeling or significance, but because it transgressed the conventional rules of language. It tried to say what can only be shown, perhaps. However, this nonsense wasn't necessarily valueless. It stemmed from deep ethical and existential desires. It was important nonsense, maybe. The later Wittgenstein, shifting his focus dramatically to ordinary language usage with his famous dictum, "Don't look for the meaning, look for the use," offered an overcoming of overcoming. He suggested we set aside the rigid dogmas of logical analysis and instead attend to the messy but rich everydayness of human social life, recognizing that meaning is made not in abstract logical structures, but in our shared forms of life and language games. How we actually use words in context. This opened up a new pathway, potentially beyond the rigid confines of both Carnap and Heidegger.
Right. So what does this all mean for the broader philosophical landscape and our initial goal of bridging that gap between knowledge and wisdom? Continental philosophy's inherent anti-scientism, which we've discussed, stems from a deep and persistent concern that the scientific conception of the world, when taken as the only valid form of knowledge, can indeed lead to nihilism and the profound alienation of human beings from the world. If everything is reduced to empirical facts and causal mechanisms, then our subjective experiences, our values, our sense of purpose can feel devalued, reducing the world to just a collection of causally determined objects or empty commodities, things to be manipulated. Jürgen Habermas, a key figure in the Frankfurt School, critically analyzed this phenomenon in his seminal work, Knowledge and Human Interests. He defines scientism not as science itself, which he valued, but as science's belief in itself. The meta-belief that knowledge is identified exclusively with science rather than seen as one vital form of knowledge among others. Habermas argued that Kant's critical philosophy, despite its internal challenges, contained an emancipatory point, a defense of human freedom and the capacity for self-determination that scientific determinism often overlooks. He powerfully concluded that self-reflection is a movement of emancipation, suggesting that by critically reflecting on our own knowledge and the interests that shape it, we can free ourselves from unacknowledged constraints and power structures.
So understanding how knowledge works can be liberating.
That's the idea. Scientism, in Habermas's view, overlooked a crucial truth, that science itself is parasitic upon a prior practical view of the world, what Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, called the life world, Lebenswelt. This life world is our closest, most familiar, most meaningful environment, the pre-theoretical lived experience of our everyday lives. It is always already colored by our cognitive, ethical, and aesthetic values before any scientific inquiry even begins. Science operates within this larger, humanly constructed framework of meaning.
That's a vital point. Science emerges from and is contextualized by our life world, our shared human experience. But this raises an important question, doesn't it? If anti-scientism is legitimate, as we've established, doesn't it also carry the significant risk of becoming obscurantism? We touched on this earlier. Our source defines this as the rejection of the causal explanations offered by natural science by referring them to an alternative causal story that is somehow of a higher order, but essentially occult. It's that familiar move where a perfectly rational scientific explanation is dismissed in favor of something vague, mystical, or simply not understandable, yet still presented as a deeper truth. Our source likens it to the X-Files complex, where scientific explanations are rejected for mysterious, enigmatic, yet still causal-sounding ones, like attributing events to the will of God or alien intelligence.
Right, replacing one explanation with another, less verifiable one.
Exactly. The text warns against equally pernicious candidates, such as certain uses of Lacan's the real or Derrida's difference, if they are employed obscurantistically to mystify rather than clarify, to shut down inquiry rather than open it up. So if we want to avoid both the dehumanizing tendencies of scientism and the irrationality of obscurantism, what's the alternative? Where's the middle ground? This is where phenomenology, as described by Merleau-Ponty, offers a still hidden center, a potential third way. Its task is to move beyond both extremes by unveiling the pre-theoretical layer of human experience, delving into the raw, lived reality that precedes scientific categorization, and then finding a felicitous description for it, a language that captures it accurately. It's about regaining what Merleau-Ponty calls perceptual faith, and relearning to see the world in its pre-reflective richness before we reduce it to objective data or obscure it with mystery. This requires a hyper-reflection upon the very substrate of our lived experience, making the implicitly known explicit.
Exactly, and Heidegger's concept of prescience further clarifies this phenomenological approach. He suggests that natural sciences, despite their power, arise from and are ultimately parasitic upon life-world practices, our everyday ways of being and interacting with the world: cooking, building, talking. These practices, he argues, are not simply reducible to natural scientific explanation because they are imbued with meaning, purpose, and value from the outset. They have their own logic. Phenomenology, then, doesn't offer alternative causal hypotheses to science. Instead, it provides a clarifying redescription of our lived experience. It tries to show us what our experience is like. It acts as a form of everyday anamnesis, which means a recalling or bringing to consciousness of tacitly known but went unnoticed aspects of ordinary life, the things we take for granted. It makes these phenomena more perspicuous, change the aspect under which they are seen. It shifts our perspective, allowing us to see familiar things in a new, profound light. Our source identifies a mini-pathology that this kind of deep dive aims to address. We need to clip the wings of both scientism and obscurantism, avoid both extremes. On one side, continental obscurantism can sometimes explain everything and nothing, often using vast, vague categories to explain everyday phenomena without true clarity. For example, reducing the entire internet to an enframing attitude or a symptom of the forgetfulness of being. While these concepts can be insightful, their misapplication can lead to intellectual fog.
All right, it becomes jargon rather than insight.
Potentially. On the other side, analytic scientism, with hypothetical titles like The Big Bang and Me, closing the explanatory gap, often assumes that all perceived gaps in understanding are ultimately empirical and will eventually be closed by more scientific data. However, the felt gap between knowledge and wisdom, the fundamental human longing for meaning that we started with, is precisely the space for critical reflection, ethical inquiry, and existential exploration, not merely empirical resolution. Science can't answer that question. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Max Weber's foundational distinction is key. Natural phenomena require causal explanation, while social phenomena require clarification by giving reasons or offering possible motives. Different kinds of understanding are needed. Philosophy's job in this context is to constantly remind us of this crucial distinction, to prevent the conflation of these different modes of inquiry. Even a leading figure from the analytic tradition, Hilary Putnam, argued powerfully for recognizing that the sphere of knowledge is wider than the sphere of science. He asserts that ethics, for example, is fundamentally about how we live and with human happiness, a distinct practical knowledge that cannot be reduced to or replaced by theoretical scientific knowledge. It's about judgment, not just facts. The urgency of this discussion is palpable. We live with and profoundly within a persistent gap between knowledge and wisdom. It's time, the source suggests, that philosophers and everyone else started to try and think about that gap. Maybe more than our personal peace of mind is at stake. It's about our collective ability to navigate a complex world with both understanding and purpose.
That's a powerful and indeed urgent call to action. Okay, let's try to unpack this as we bring our deep dive to a close. We've journeyed through the ancient roots, the complex historical origins, the profound divisions, and ultimately the core aspirations of continental philosophy. We've seen how this vibrant, often challenging intellectual tradition relentlessly strives to bridge that fundamental, persistent gap between what we know intellectually and how we live a truly meaningful life. That initial problem we discussed. Our source suggests that the often cited analytic continental split is not some eternal, unavoidable chasm, but perhaps a tiresome split, an unfortunate temporary breakdown of communication that is largely a consequence of philosophy's own professionalization in the 20th century. The way universities are structured, perhaps. It's exactly. This academic specialization, it argues, has led to the weakening of philosophy's critical function and to its progressive marginalization in the life of culture. Philosophy may be retreated into its own corner. So here's where it gets really interesting for us, for you listening. Immanuel Kant's enduring call to sapere aude, dare to think for yourself, remains paramount. We shouldn't passively await new grand continental paradigms from across the channel or new analytic breakthroughs from labs or logic departments to solve all our dilemmas. Instead, what's truly needed is creative, inventive thematic work, clearly argued conceptual creation that relates critically to our traditions, both philosophical and cultural, rather than just passive commentary or narrow problem solving. This deep dive ultimately aims to help you, our listener, understand the two cultures problem in philosophy, the fundamental and often unproductive clash between a purely scientific explanation of the world and a humanistic interpretation of meaning and value. Recognizing both and striving for their integration is not just an academic nicety, but maybe a vital skill for navigating modern life.
Right. And this brings us to a crucial final thought, and it raises an important question. What, then, is the ultimate promise of philosophy in our contemporary world beyond these historical and conceptual debates? The promise, as our source eloquently articulates, is its potential to be an essential part in the life of a culture, not just an academic department. Philosophy, when practiced in its broadest, most engaged sense, enables critical reflection within our specific contexts. It invites you to analyze the world in which they find themselves and to question what passes for common sense in your society by daring to ask the most general, most enduring, and often most uncomfortable questions. What is justice? What is love? What is the meaning of life? These are not questions that can be answered with a scientific formula or simple data set. They require ongoing reflection. This continuous inquiry and rigorous argumentation, this act of pushing beyond the obvious and challenging assumptions, can have a profound educative, emancipatory effect, a transformative power that extends far beyond the classroom walls. As Stanley Cavell, another philosopher who sought to bridge divides, wisely noted, philosophy is the education of grown-ups. It's about embracing this continuous learning, this unending process of questioning, growth, and self-reflection, recognizing that this essential task is as relevant now, in our complex, information-saturated age, as it was in the bustling agora of ancient Greece. It's about finding wisdom, perhaps not in final answers, but in the act of relentless, honest inquiry itself.